One of the most important things I've learned about teaching over the years is how critical it is to tie the abstractions and the concepts and perhaps somewhat simplified negotiation exercises to a corresponding reality. It's easy to live in the world of abstractions, which is comfortable from journals and from experiments, and it's highly suggestive of application. But I find that really spending time trying to locate real manifestations of the phenomena that you're discussing is valuable. In short, you have to help build the bridge from abstraction to reality. And this means insisting on good diagnoses and driving to prescription.
Highlight the importance of understanding the psychology of conflict and why, under some circumstances, what seems irrational to you or me may be perfectly rational. The most profound thing for me in terms of strategy in teaching is to help students understand this idea of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It is seemingly such a simple concept, but not easy to do, and particularly when working in these politically fraught environments where the other person is a dire enemy and maybe even completely dehumanized, and how you get into that other person's shoes and also see the benefit of doing that.
I'm trying to work harder in these past few years in particular to identify a few core skills, a basket of skills, if you will, that I believe students need to really improve their performance as negotiators. Developing a professional reputation index for students to try to mirror real-world consequences of behaving perhaps badly in negotiation, and to have students think about the limits of being a very aggressive and hard bargainer and the impact of that on their reputation both inside the classroom and outside.
Because it's a little bit more about what has become more a part of my repertoire, more something, kind of a transfer from stuff I was told to stuff that I actually think really mattered. Less is more. My instinct, because I love the material that I teach, is to try to fit as much of it into a class session or even over the course of a semester or class that I possibly can. What I've really come to learn is if students are going to really remember things, actually learn how to practice them, become more mindful of them, breaking it down into smaller pieces really matters, and covering less ground more thoroughly is really critical.
When I first started teaching, I was working with Roger and Bruce, and they had this theory that, there's no answers. You're not really teaching what the answer is. You're teaching how do you go about investigating and experimenting in your own life to find out what's working for you. I try to cut everything that I teach down into 10 or 15-minute chunks. Whereas when I started, I would say, okay, we need an hour and a half to do prep by side, and that always has to follow the good outcome lecture. Now I try to get everything into as small units as I can, because then you are much freer to reorganize them. And then I find you put the same 5 units in a different order, you've got a totally different class with a
one of the things that I have found really interesting is the extent to which I now pay much more attention to what's in the internal voice of the people in the room. So I'm really paying attention to what does this student need to work on or this student need to learn. And in a client context, I'm paying attention to what are the challenges that they face that I can help them with, so that I'm responding to their context and their needs, rather than, what are valuable things that I know.
When I think about what I've personally learned about negotiation as a process, what tends to be effective, I've started to internalize that and incorporating it into my understanding of the teaching and learning process. Truly trying to see from the student's perspective, what does this process look like to them, right? What do they come here understanding? What do they come here wondering? What do they already know or assume that they can build on? What do they think they know or assume that they may need to unlearn, right? So fully trying to get into their shoes and understanding their perspective is something that I've tried to do more and more the longer I've been teaching.
And I did produce two video, what I call problem cases, where a specific kind of negotiation problem arises with real actors, and students then have to react to it in real time. I think it's the importance of stories, stories and cases, real concrete cases. I think if you have the right stories to illustrate the points we're talking about, it really locks in the concept. Students understand, I think, often the concrete case a lot easier than the abstract concept. So I think it's really important to build and have a whole library of appropriate cases and stories to tell.
One of the things that I do is now really have them engage with some sort of situation that they're struggling with themselves, and have them kind of prepare it in class and role play it and get peer feedback. And I think that that helps make the research and the concepts that we apply much more useful and personally meaningful to them. I think that that's often a very profound moment of insight. I hear that again and again and again. Geez, you know, I walk into these situations all the time and I never think about preparing for them. And just the process of spending an hour or so with a peer, walking through a problem, you know, what would you do? What actions do you want to take away from the table? How can you be maximally persuasive at the table? You know, what homework do you need to do? Who would you like to, you know, speak to in advance of the negotiation? Walking through all those types of questions becomes very enlightening, and I think on the whole, very empowering.
I try to do it all with, rather than describe it to them, I want them to catch themselves in that behavioral bias. And the first they notice other people doing it, and they're like, ha ha ha, and then you go like, yeah, but look at you too, buddy, yeah. And because, you know, it's baked in, it's all of us. But that, I think, having them experience it rather than hear about it or see it in others is much more powerful.
You want to let the student explain, here's why I think it's like climbing a mountain, or here's why I think it's like building a bridge. And in an exercise like that, you start to get a sense of, okay, they're coming here with this set of assumptions about what negotiation is. And so once you have that kind of understanding, you can, I think that helps give some guidance as a teacher about, you know, where are you building on what they already think or what they already know? Where might you want to push back on some of their assumptions and get them to re-examine them, question them, think about whether they might want to adjust, adapt, expand.
I am structuring the early opportunities to volunteer for things so that I'm asking them to do something that is very easy and that shows the request is to do something badly. Right? So either it's just read these two things and we can laugh about it and talk about it, or who can come up and show how this goes when it goes badly. Well, everybody knows how to do that. They're not asked to get up and demonstrate competence. They're asked to get up and demonstrate incompetence and some humor. And that really sets the tone for the rest of the day. And if I can get that moving in the first 15 minutes, then there's a cohesion and an honesty there that will serve us well through the rest of the day.
So very early on, if there are participants who seem problematic, instead of ignoring them, you have to kind of address it. Because if you don't address it, you may say only one or two or three people, but that can seriously affect the quality of the learning atmosphere in the room. And I think early in my teaching, I thought that so long as it was one or two people and the other ones were fine, you didn't have to pay attention to it. And I think that is wrong.
Or I'll say to someone, okay, Bill, if I've got a skeptic in the room, which I love skeptics, they're so helpful, and I'll see it on their face and I'll say, all right, Bill, you're thinking something, what is it? Just say it so that we can talk about it. Because I'm also trying to model, look, if you want to connect with your teams and you want them to be candid with you in these conversations, you need to be engaging not what they're saying, but what they're really thinking of you. And so I'm trying to show them how they can do that in a meeting in the training side.
That sort of goes back to what you were saying about Dan and Roger's emotional interest. That showing transparency assumes a level of affiliation, right? Because who are you transparent with?
That's nice.
Well, or at least in a healthy marriage, right? With whoever you, yeah. Exactly, yeah.
And I do encourage them to take on the analysis of something that they know, something that they're involved in. And it really pushes them to think differently, because they have to, the whole idea of being in the other person's shoes is part of the assignment, and they don't always get it. So they come in here, they talk to me, they're struggling, and we work it through. And it doesn't happen 100% of the time, but when it does, it's really a remarkable learning experience. And I can tell you that I get emails even now from students who are out in the field saying, I use these things every day, it's so important to me, and thank you for helping me see that there's a different way to do problem solving in the world.
I teach gender negotiation, and I think particularly for those types of ideological topics, it's extremely helpful if the participants have some, very clear, well-vetted, carefully conducted data with which they can interact. And I think that really helps raise the discussion above, what women do and what men do, and helps people engage even if they're having some emotional resistance to the topic. You can draw them in talking about the data. Let's talk about the data, or how could you conduct the study otherwise?
That the more I can make people wrestle with the real challenges of negotiation. In other words, whether it's a case study where you bring people to a decision point where the actions are not clear and the barriers are high, and people do their best to diagnose the situation, figure what's going on, and struggle with that challenge. And sometimes wait till the next class when they've read, for example, the P case to see what people did and if it worked or it didn't work. And then say, I didn't necessarily see that, but having really struggled intellectually and often emotionally with a challenge, and then have at least one party's approach to that revealed, is much more valuable than having it too seamlessly laid out.
I think getting them as much as possible in the beginning outside of their context is something that I think is really important. I think if you're too in their context, what they want to talk about is the right answer, how it went last time, some really good story that they have. And if I'm trying to get them to be more mindful about their own negotiation behaviors, and then give them a framework for understanding negotiation and thinking about it more intentionally, getting them out of the familiar context is really important.
I used to think of negotiation issues in transactional terms only. More recently, I've been thinking about negotiation and writing about negotiation in terms of the leadership dimensions, that negotiation is a fundamental skill of leadership, and in many of the cases that we are teaching, it's not only a matter of negotiating with the other side, it's a matter of leading your own team to deal with internal problems of negotiation.
About the ethics of negotiation and the role of what we might call here in Cambridge strategic misrepresentation, and where students become infuriated with those who are less than truthful, and it seems to undermine their learning experience. And so I have focused hard on not creating Mother Teresa's, but at least on having students think hard about the consequences of doing harm in negotiation, and thinking very hard about how to improve relationships and indeed trust building with the other side, with one's counterparts, by being more ethically aware of one's behavior.
It's been really interesting for me to notice the extent to which I'm paying attention to the group dynamics in the room. And I'm using Roger and Dan Shapiro's emotional interest in the room, because I'm learning names, I'm making moves that try to create affiliation in the room, I'm giving people status, so I don't care whether they're learning it from me. So I will remember and say, Bruno, 10 minutes ago, this was the question you were raising, which was such a great question. And here, Cynthia, you're talking about how we might be able to address that. So what do you think, right? So I'm tapping the questions that they're giving me to connect them to each other so that they can really see the ways in which they can continue to coach each other and help each other long after I'm gone.
believe it or not, I'm still using some of the same cases and simulations that I've used for years, the old standbys, oil pricing, Parker Gibson, Sally Soprano, and I know we should all be exceedingly tired of these by now, but I find that even now, after all these years, they are incredibly powerful because they're so direct and simple, and I've used them not just here at Fletcher, but literally all over the world. And even though the scenarios seem very American-centric, they actually translate quite well.
I've learned that nodding heads and apparent understanding doesn't necessarily mean people are understanding or getting it. So concepts that we can easily gloss over are ones that we need to spend more time on. So for example, a simple concept like the difference between an interest and a position is something that I think negotiation teachers think is obvious and simplistic, and yet students aren't particularly good at it, and spending a lot of time drilling on that really matters.
Introducing students to very complex, long exercises where they experience what I like to call cognitive flooding. There are multiple parties and multiple issues, and while students often tell us they are good at multitasking, they are not good at multi-tracking and keeping control of their brief, understanding the multiple flows of information, who has the stronger BATNA, who has more resources, being able to keep track of a complex conversation, to be able to find allies, to be able to deal with adversaries and recruit multiple stakeholders to your particular position.
We'll go through a simulation and debrief it, for instance, like a team simulation. And then I will put up some data from, say, medical teams. And I'll say, okay, look at the patterns in these medical teams, and then try to help them draw connections between the experience that they just had and then the data, the social scientific data that we have on the medical teams. And I think that that really helps broaden the relevance of what they're studying and help them understand how it would apply to practice.
So Mike Wheeler insistently asks me, this is a case of what? And I say, it's an interesting setting, or there's this or that phenomena. Case of what? And John Hammond reminds me that I should know what I want to be ringing in students' ears at the end of the class, the one or two things that really matter. And the link between this being a case of what and those one or two things to be ringing in the students' ears, the better and more clearly I can answer those questions, the more effectively I can teach.
A teacher needs to think about, what is my big message unit? What am I trying to convey today? And then what is what I'm doing, or how is what I'm doing kind of tailored to achieve that end? So formulas tend not to work very well, but really breaking down in a thoughtful and intentional way what my purpose is, and then is what I'm doing kind of tailored to that really matters.
When I first started, I was really concerned with, do I know what I want to tell them? Am I saying the thing right so that I sound really smart and that I'm really correct? And that strikes me now as like the least important part of it. That it helps a lot once you know your material really well, you've thought it through a lot. But the nicest thing about that is then when that becomes automatic, when what you want to say to them is not something you have to think about anymore, it's just like driving a car, that frees you to pay more attention to them.
Shifting the balance between preparation and adaptation or improvisation. So when I first started teaching, I was very, very organized. I think I had a fear of losing control. So I would have an agenda, and I would have a very clear outline of how long we would spend on each activity, the exact takeaways that students were supposed to get. And I think I was fearful of getting off track, of going to a place that I hadn't prepared for or thought about in advance. And the longer I've been teaching, the more willing I've become. In fact, the more I've welcomed and invited and expected that we're going to deviate from whatever plan I had.
In my early years of teaching, and later as well, I often gravitated to case studies or negotiation exercises or role plays that were really compelling and out of which I got a great discussion and a lot of excitement and energy. And I think that's a really good thing. But not only do you want to furnish individual pearls, you want to also figure out how to string them together. What's the necklace as well as the pearls? And you want to teach the course, not the case. The broader framework that is really what you're seeking to convey in your back and forth interactions with the students. And it's awfully easy to be seduced by good individual experiences that may not really add up to a substantial improvement in people's capacity to diagnose complex challenges and act effectively.
To give that feeling of spontaneity that people also really value, have that modularity allows you to reconnect it, and by reconnecting it in different ways, I find I notice new stuff about it myself, and that makes me excited and interested in it as I'm giving it, and that I think is communicated to the audience. Just from a performing point of view, it's more interesting to be a jazz player than to be a marching band, tuba guy. And so if you can organize it for yourself as like a jazz thing, then you're more interested and excited, and they feel that. I mean, they smell that on you and they respond to it.